We've seen this map over and over again, but for all intents and purposes, the election really came down to 7 states. Obviously, this is news to know, and we all knew these were going to be the swing states. Pretty much the other 43 states are solidified in the way they vote. When you look up information about the election, though, it's not exactly the easiest to find everything in one place, so I put it all in Excel and tried to make it as easy for you as possible to understand. I put the 2024 swing states here. These are the most important. The 2016 swing states, like back then when those were swing states, are included here as well. Under extra states, I put a bunch of uncompetitive states, but they're just kind of fun to look at and see the trends. When we look at the last 3 election cycles, we see that 2016 and 2020 were really close. When we look at 2016, we see that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are all decided by less than 1%, Michigan being 0.2%, which is insanely close. When we look at how many votes that was actually decided by, it was 10,000 in Michigan, 22,000 in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by 44,000. That's insane. Notably, Nevada was also decided by 27,000 votes, but it's a bit deceptive because Nevada's population is a lot smaller than some of these other states. When it comes to 2020, we see that the margins are once again super thin. Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada all decided by less than 1%, and specifically Georgia and Arizona by 0.2 and 0.3% respectively. Those numbers come out to 20,000 votes, 11,000 votes, which is tiny in Georgia, 10,000 votes in Arizona, once again super tiny in Nevada by 13,000 votes, as if the margin could get even smaller. So what comes as a total surprise to us is that not only Trump wins all 7 swing states this time, he wins some of them by a pretty big margin. I mean, most notably Arizona, 5.5%. That's not even swing state territory anymore. Also, only Wisconsin was decided by less than 1%, whereas previously we had 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 3 states over here decided by less than 1%. When we look at the 2024 election as a whole versus the 2020 election, every state basically went way more to the right. So everyone's been reporting that. This is common knowledge at this point. This is fascinating because when we look at Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada, they all had very significant shifts respectively. 4% is not a small amount in a swing state. When we look at 2024 versus 2016, we can see that the 2 states that go to the left are North Carolina and Georgia, but 0.4% is not really that much. When we look at the other swing states, we can see here that Arizona and Nevada had the most significant, when we look at Arizona and Nevada, they had the most significant shifts, and we see that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all shifted a little more to the right, but Wisconsin really didn't budge at all. And we can see that Wisconsin tries to make it as close as possible at all times. In all 3 of the last elections, it was 22,000, 20,000, and 29,000 votes respectively, so that's a very close state. When we look at the old swing states of Ohio, New Hampshire, Florida, and Minnesota, we can see that they all shifted very heavily to the right. Of course, Minnesota being this weird state that was pretty swing statey in 2016, goes all the way to the left in 2020, and then comes back a little. New Hampshire's fascinating. I can't tell what the hell happened up there. It was a swing state in 2016, really close, decided by 0.37%. Then it goes really far to the left, kind of like Minnesota did, all the way to 7%, and then it comes all the way back to 2.7%, kind of getting back into that swing state territory. So New Hampshire, can someone tell me what's going on? So rightfully, I put a question mark in their column because that's what they deserve. Ohio used to be a swing state, and somehow it came out as 8% in 2016, but now this is firmly out of reach for the Dems, at least for now. Florida was fascinating. It used to be a huge swing state, kind of like California was back like 50 or 60 years ago. Florida was won by 1% in 2016 and very close. Then in 2020 it was a little more solidly red, and then all of a sudden in 2024 it goes up 10%, which is nuts. I can probably attribute it to a few factors. Florida, with DeSantis as their leader, decided to ignore most of the restrictions. They kind of just let life go on over there, and they did okay for it because here we are in society. We don't wear masks anymore. We learned that COVID was probably the most overblown thing of the century and a great excuse to shut down the whole economy and, try to make things as miserable as possible for everyone in the future. Whoop-de-doo. When we look at Minnesota, this is another weird one, kind of like New Hampshire. They start out over here similar to New Hampshire. At 1.5% Hillary had won it. Then it goes up to 7%, which is a huge jump. Minnesota ends up being an outlier in 2024 because after this huge shift to the left from 2020, now comes back to the right, not by a whole lot, but enough to kind of be in that swing state territory again. Maybe not swing state, but kind of close enough, which was unexpected because as someone who was the governor of that state, that they won it by only 4%. These are the uncompetitive states. Usually these are going to be double-digit margins. Some of these I chose intentionally, and some of these were just kind of picked at random. Some of these states had significant shifts, some not so much. One of the more interesting ones was that Texas was won by 9%, and then it was only won by 5.5% in 2020. That's fascinating. It's noteworthy that it's 8.2%. I chose California very intentionally because this was one of the most significant shifts in the entire union. When you look at 2016, it was won by almost 30%. So that's insane because 30% of a huge state like that just means it's slam dunk California Democrat all day. Of course, we all know that that's just a very common sense stereotype these days. 2020, hardly any shift, but now 2024, 20.15%. Of course, that's still not even close. But when we look at the shift here, 9% in that state, this is like when you think of home field advantage, like California is that for the Dems. Harris's home state is California. So the fact she lost 10 points like that in comparison to Biden, that's mind-boggling. I knew that Illinois wasn't that competitive, and it remained to be about the same percentage as 2016, but when we look at 2024, now it's only 11%. That's a 6% shift. This is with Chicago being in Illinois. This is another one of these home field advantage states. So for it to have lost 6 points, not a good sign. New Jersey had one of the biggest shifts in the entire country as well. When we look at 13 or 14% going up to 16%, New Jersey's been known to be a very, very liberal state. And then it jumps all the way to just under 6% for 2024. Of course, Harris was going to win that, no doubt, but only 6% of cushion. I mean, that's pretty dangerous for them. And who would have expected that out of New Jersey of all places? I mean, when you think of home field advantage states, you think of California, New York, Illinois, and then New Jersey's pretty much up there as like a silver medal kind of, almost gold medal territory, liberal state. Another huge loss was New York. Of course, Harris still won this, no worries there. But when you go from 22 and 23 points to only 12 points, I mean, 12 points is another hemorrhaging that New Jersey had. To lose that much percentage on two of their huge heavy hitters, I mean, that's unthinkable to anyone 8 years ago for sure. Now we get to some of the more fun states I just decided to pick. Mississippi, just draw it out of a hat basically. I don't know why. You look at this, it goes from 18 points and 16 points to 23 points. That's a pretty big jump, 6%. Yeah. Oklahoma from 36 to 33 to 34. This is one of the most conservative states. I didn't actually know it was 36 points. That's a lot. So technically it actually lost a few points from 2016, but their population is very small. So trying to shift that 536,000 votes is no small task. Of course, this is kind of a weird state just because the numbers stayed almost the exact same. Massachusetts, another one of the New England hemorrhagers, it goes from 27% to 33%. Those are pretty much California numbers, always out of reach. And then all of a sudden you go to 24%. Of course, it's not really that big of a deal. They went to the right 2%. So nothing significant there, just thought it would be fun to put it in. Colorado is another one of these kind of 2016 swing states. 2016 was mildly competitive at just under 5%, but it jumps all the way up to 13%. And yes, it swings a little bit to the right, but that's pretty insignificant at only 2%. Maryland, pretty similar to Massachusetts in that way. It goes up from 26 to 33 and then right back down to 28. In comparison, Maryland is actually a little more to the left than it was in 2016, which is pretty crazy. And Oklahoma actually slightly more to the left than it was in 2016. How about them apples? Obviously 33%, it's just a joke. So how many votes did Trump win by this time? Well, that's where we go to our trusty scratch sheet down here. From my calculation, it looks like the closest that Harris could have won is by about 230,000 votes. That would just require switching Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Hypothetically, if we switch Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, you can see here that Harris would have got 270 and Trump would have got 268, the perfect number. In 2020, Trump would have had to win Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, and that would have been by 56,000 votes, giving Trump 275. And you can see that right here. As you can see, in 2016, Trump won by about 104,000 votes. If Clinton had flipped Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, she would have had 273. And if we look at our trusty interactive map, we can see here that if we flip Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, she gets a 273. Even though this was a landslide, as they're calling it, it really wasn't won by much. 230,000 votes is really not that much in the grand scheme of things, especially when you take into consideration that Biden let the floodgates open with illegals. This delicate, fragile margin of victory, as we've seen in the last 3 elections, could easily be overthrown by more and more illegals being allowed into the country. And even with that said, Trump's probably going to get in there on day one. He's got that guy who sounds like a pretty hard ass about border situation, but there's already been so much damage done in the last 4 years, and a lot of it maybe not is irreparable, but it's going to take a long time. We would have to have so many successive presidencies in a row doing the right things that it looks pretty impossible, especially with these margins of victory. Continuing onward, we'll look at voter turnout now. Some overall trends about the voter turnout from 2016 to 2020 and 2024. We just see this as kind of like a baseline. Apparently you can go back to 2008, go to 2012, 2016. It kind of goes up a little bit and makes a little more sense. Obviously with COVID, 2020 happened, and then you get this explosion of votes that can be attributed mainly just to people sitting around, not doing a whole lot, myself being one of those folks at that time. The thing about COVID was you could really get away with not paying attention to politics or any current events before it, but during COVID, it was impossible not to. at least in certain states. They were shoving shit down our throats daily, and we couldn't do anything about it, and we had to sit there and listen to it. When you have a population that's sitting around and not necessarily doing anything, and then you have the also advent of mail-in ballots, now people have the time to vote and they have easier access to voting than ever. So with those two major changes, of course, voter turnout is going to explode. But here's where things kind of get strange. We see disconnect in 2024. I highlighted in this column which states lost votes, and these couple of tan states of Maryland, Oklahoma, and Texas are basically the exact same vote number. You can see that presented here in this column by the percentage of population. 14,000, 5,000, and 1,000 votes respectively are nothing in those states. So basically for all intents and purposes, those voter turnouts remain the exact same. When you look at all the swing states, there was population increase of at least 1% in every state except Arizona. Arizona lost votes. Of course, it's really not that different than Texas or Oklahoma or Maryland. It's, 0.2%, but optically that's just not great because Arizona was one of the most controversial states in 2020, and most of us were expecting them to take forever again in 2024 to get their election stuff in. Actually, I think Arizona was one of the last states to report. The optics of Arizona have just not been good, especially with Maricopa County and all that jazz. I just can't believe that this election was decided on the first night. We look at Ohio losing 5% of their voter base. What the hell is that? Either way, it looks pretty strange when Ohio loses a bunch of voters, Florida loses some voters, and Minnesota loses a trace amount. But when we look at California, they lost 1.6 million voters. What the hell is that? Illinois, New York, and New Jersey lost hundreds of thousands. This shift is pretty wild. This doesn't look too crazy. This is kind of whatever. This is like almost the same, but this, what the hell is this? This lost a lot of voters. New Jersey, a pretty healthy amount of voters were gone. New York, another one of these. Mississippi surprisingly lost 88,000. That's pretty big chunk for them. The other thing I didn't mention was that if you're in one of these states where the margin is so huge of victory, you almost don't feel the need to show up. That could be slightly in play. But that brings us back to Arizona. They shouldn't be losing voters, right? I don't know. Either way, the number's just not that consistent. What's really wild when you look at these 2024 versus 2016 numbers is most of these margins of victory are decided by really small amounts in these swing states. So when you look at the fact that they gained this many hundreds of thousands of voters, in the case of North Carolina, almost a million for Michigan, 500,000 for Wisconsin, kind of close to. Pennsylvania getting up to 1 million, Georgia over 1 million, that's crazy. Arizona pretty much close to 1 million, and Nevada close to 400,000. Nevada gaining almost as many as Wisconsin, even though Nevada is less populated than Wisconsin is by a pretty healthy margin. It's just crazy to me that the trend ends up being so close in all of these races, even though they gain this many hundreds of thousands of people. Just a thought, in 8 years, if you're getting hundreds of thousands of votes and the state is still really close, doesn't that mean something about the culture there? Living in one of these states is for sure going to be different than living in one of these. If you do live in one of the swing states and you have experience living elsewhere, write in the comments how obvious those differences are in the cultures of each of the states you have experience with. And finally, moving on to third-party votes, we can see in 2016 that these numbers are huge. The smallest was really Arizona, and it looks like Mississippi voting for 2% only, but pretty much everyone across the board has at least 4%. When you go to 2020, all of a sudden that shift gets completely decimated to just 1%. The biggest numbers that we can see here are highlighted in yellow, but not too many states have 2%. So when we go to 2024, now they're getting into the 0.88 region, 0.74. We didn't see that before. And that's, I guess, in only the swing states here. This is interesting to think about. The third party vote being 3% is actually in the 4 states that we talked about being Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, and New York. Maybe Maryland, not so much from what we talked about before, but New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts, definitely. I guess people are opting out of the Democrat Party. A point I want to bring up is when you're voting for third party, look at these margins, right? 1.96 in Michigan, definitely higher than 0.8%. When you're in Wisconsin, 0.88, it's higher than the 0.5%. Pennsylvania, right on the money with 0.9. Nevada having 1.92% of third party voters. Easily could have swung the election over here. So I'm not saying that we should never vote for the third party, but the third party is getting enough votes to kind of swing these elections. Of course, that margin's been reduced significantly. I guess people learn their lesson when you have the numbers that were these high and the election was decided by this amount. Realistically, with having gotten Trump back in there, the border's probably going to be closed. We're not going to be withdrawing from Afghanistan like complete doofuses. With Trump getting back in there, the deep state's no longer going to be using the puppet on the strings tactic that was so easy to implement with Biden being president. The big takeaway of all this is that obviously we needed to really close the border. Even if 75 million people didn't seem to think so, we needed to stop throwing $200 billion of taxpayer money at Ukraine. And also the high likelihood that we probably won't get into any new wars, at least with Trump in office. Or at least the fact that he won't be perpetuating any wars or actively trying to set the grounds for the next president to get into something. Like we saw from 2016 during 2020 under his watch. Even though those are the simple things that Trump ran on, Kamala still got 75 million votes. And Kamala didn't represent anything in particular different from the Biden administration. I mean, she was the VP, and look at what Biden didn't really do. I mean, that's 4 years worth of garbage, and basically people looked at that and said, yes, please give me more. More open borders, more funding to Ukraine, and more foreign conflict. If we can get into any sort of war, I want to do that. Let's go 75 million people. Let's do it. Obviously, I'm being very facetious. They're not thinking in those terms. They're thinking a lot more as, you know, orange man bad, he's very bad, I'm not going to vote for someone, the lesser of two evils, blah, blah, blah. But those are going to be the end results regardless. And the unfortunate reality is that uninformed votes are just going to weigh the same as informed votes. I mean, seriously, you could have someone on TikTok for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and then another person who's reading books, doing something with their life, and those two people's votes are going to be weighted the same. I mean, even though Trump is going to be in office, we came this close to not having him in office and having permanent Democrat rule through nature of them just importing shitloads of people into the swing states and calling it a day. You can see that the margins were really fragile, as I showed you. I'm a little bit surprised that this election went as smoothly as it did, because given the 2020 election, I didn't see how this could possibly go smoothly. But if they were willing to vote for someone who was unlikable as Kamala and give her 75 million votes, just like they voted for Biden at 81 million votes, and everything we've done to get to this point will just be sacrificed and forgotten. I mean, think about it like this. We have it all cushy and nice now. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than communism. If we did let something like that seep into the United States, which is really not that far off, and we fast forward to those dystopian worlds, how will we be able to tell our grandchildren and our sons with a straight face that we let that happen under our watch? The implications here are grave. And, you know, this is something we can vote our way into, but we're going to have to shoot our way out if we let it get there. At the end of the day, that's how they see him. They see him as the anti-communist. Just remember this. Even though this was a landslide, you have to remember that this was only decided by a few 100,000 votes. And in the grand scheme of a country with 331 million people or so, that's not by much. And we're teetering on the edge of letting someone like that get into office again. And this is after 4 years of pretty much huge disaster. I mean, I don't have to tell you how bad things are. If you look at this random inflation calculator, it basically says that things have gone up 21%. And this is just as an aggregate. Things have gotten significantly worse over the last 4 years. And people looked that in the eye and said, yes, that's what we want. Keep it going. Like, are you fucking kidding me? A lot of these 75 million people just have no conception of what's about to happen. And the dark road you go down when you go into big government territory, how impossible it is to get back out. Alright, that's going to be it. I hope you learned something valuable and new. I tried to arm you with as much information as possible about the prior 3 elections, and I hope that you're able to take away something valuable from this. I'm baffled that nobody's made a video about this, or at least you can't find a video on this. I wonder why. But what I'm doing is being as brave as I can be for you guys, and when you just keep scrolling and going down, I'm just looking for someone to not be on the mainstream, you know? No Vox, Wall Street Journal, MSNBC, Sky News, Today. You know, this is probably the first person who's not like it, but this doesn't even have to do with my video title. At this point, we're just wasting time. I want to shoot myself. 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 Oh my God, is it ever gonna end?